If you're not excited for D4 Season 9, it's time to get hyped. The Druid just got insane buffs, and we're not talking about little number adjustments like we've seen a lot in the past. I'm talking about serious changes, so let me get straight into them. Now before I start, the coolest thing about this is a lot of this is direct feedback that I gave to the devs, and they almost implemented it one for one, which is insane. I'll note which ones I gave feedback for when we go through it. So first off, Pulverize got a big buff to its base damage. They changed the enhanced Pulverize, so we're no longer getting the overpower every 10 seconds, but they nerfed overpower so much that I don't think it really matters. But Pulverize now deals 30% increased damage to crowd-controlled enemies and bosses. So it works for both things, and it's not just limited to crowd control. Raging Pulverize was changed from 75% overpower damage to now giving the guaranteed overpower, so we didn't actually lose that, it was just changed. And enemies take 20% more damage for 5 seconds. This is kind of interesting because the way they changed overpower is they basically completely nerfed it to the ground. And in my mind, when I was listening to the amount that they're nerfing it, I was like, okay, so what is it, just a utility thing now? And this definitely looks like they're going in that direction. So the overpower might be used for, say, keeping your Grizzly Rage active on bosses, but otherwise it's just buffing your damage. Now this one is actually really good, and I'm super excited for it. So Stormclaw, buff number 1 to Stormclaw, is that Storm Strike after chaining is going to continue to chain to old targets that were hit. So previously, if it hit an enemy, only hit each enemy one time, and this made it so that the AoE on it was not nearly as good. Now this is actually insane, because if you have 2 enemies alive, it's just going to chain back and forth between them, and you're going to see insane damage. So this change alone makes Stormclaw viable. But there are actually several other changes, even some before these patch notes, that made Stormclaw even better. So we're going to see a Season 9 Stormclaw that's better than we've ever had. Obviously, I was pushing for Stormclaw buffs a lot because that's my go-to build. Alright, for Grizzly Rage, companion skills are always usable during Grizzly Rage. This was direct feedback that I gave, and I also gave feedback about the rank 5 bonus not really being that great. So now instead of companion skills can be cast during Grizzly Rage, which is now an inherent bonus, now we get 30% increased armor while Grizzly Rage is active. The main thing that this is going to do is it's actually going to open up the ability to use Tybalt's Will more often, because now you don't need as much armor. And that actually synergizes really well with other changes because they made it to where you're always unstoppable during your ultimate now. They also made a change to provocation. So before you would get an overpower every certain number of seconds, now you get a flat 10-second timer, and what it does is it gives you the guaranteed overpower, and it also increases the damage by 15%. So even though we're not really going to build into overpower anymore, this is still good for anyone who's using Werebear. Now, Toxic Claws, this is actually a pretty cool buff, because before it was 15% increased poison damage, so that's actually 20% if you have the Shroud of False Death. But now, when you are a werewolf, you're getting double. So this is a 40% damage multiplier, and there's actually certain ways to get Toxic Claws, whether it be on an amulet or on the Waxing Gibbous. So there's definitely some new multipliers to work with, and this plays really well into my builds, because for Season 9, you might notice a little bit of a trend here. Poison Pulverize, Poison Tread, Poison Stormclaw, Poison Boulder, Poison Landslide, Poison Tornado, Poison Storm, and it'll probably be the rest of them as well. Because, in my opinion, the best way to play this season is going to be going with Grizzly Rage and the Rabid Bear aspect. But I'm still working on perfecting my builds for the season, so there's room for these to change. This is another thing that I gave feedback on. They just ended up doing a little bit of a damage increase, but Nature's Fury now has a 40% damage increase. So that, on top of the ability to cast the extra casts of skills, means that this is much more viable than it was before. Ursine Strength, they made it to where the bonuses will remain for 8 seconds after leaving Werebear form. I don't see this node getting used a lot anymore because they kind of nerfed Overpower to the ground, but it's possible. We'll see what happens. Shockwave aspect will now trigger your puddle for the Rotting Lightbringer. That's the new unique two-hander that you can use for Pulverize. I have to do the math on this one. I'm not entirely sure if it's going to be better to use Shockwave or to just go with a different aspect, because Shockwave doesn't actually scale your puddle's damage, whereas something like Retaliation would. So I'm going to have to look at it and see if it's worth it to run Shockwave, but this makes it much more likely that it will be worth it to use the Shockwave aspect. Aspect of the Rabid Bear, like I said, almost every build this season I'm planning on using it was doubled in its damage, so that is actually a huge buff. And I should also note, for Stormclaw specifically, the aspect of the Rabid Bear, what it's doing is it's converting all of your damage to the same type, being poison damage. So typically, when you're using Stormclaw, you don't focus any damage into the claw part of it, because you can't buff the physical damage from claw and buff the lightning damage from the Storm Strike properly. Now we can buff both of them, because they'll both be elemental damage, non-physical damage, and The Crone already makes them both Storm skills, and Tempest Roar is making them both Werewolf. So now across the board, we have synergy. Another buff for Grizzly Rage, we've got Rampaging Werebeast is now 100% up from 60%. And again, this was direct feedback I gave because I was like, well, a 60% buff is not going to compete with a 75% from Retaliation when you have to actually stack it up. So why is it not a higher amount like 100%? So this is great to see. And by the way, I'm pretty sure Rampaging Werebeast actually works the same as Starless Skies, to where each of these little stacks ends up being its own multiplier. So it ends up being a little bit higher than the 60% or the 100%. I can't confirm that 100%, but I believe that's how it works. Now, this is a huge change. I've given this feedback multiple times. I know other people have. I'm not going to take credit for it for sure because it's been said since the beginning of time. But I gave this feedback recently. Direwolf's aspect is now a utility aspect. This is huge. It forever has taken up an offensive slot, and it made it to where anytime you try to use Grizzly Rage as a werewolf, it basically just took away a damage aspect and added in a little bit of damage from the Grizzly Rage, so it was hard to justify using this for werewolf. Now it's finally utility, which means we're going to be able to use Grizzly Rage, get the extra damage from Grizzly Rage, use stuff like the Rampaging Werebeast, and it just solves a lot of issues. So this is awesome to see. And it finally frees us from the Hurricane, because pretty much always we've used the Storm Shifters aspect to get the extra 5 shapeshifting skill points. Is still good if you can fit it into your build, but this gives us a different option, but overall just a great change. And this might sound a little backwards, but I actually like that the spirit cost reduction is not as much as it was before, because there's a problem when you have too much spirit cost reduction that you're not triggering your ancestral guidance passive as much as you need to keep uptime. So I actually like that, because then I can just get more spirit generation into the build and it'll solve that problem. This is another great one. I didn't give this feedback, it was somebody else, but Ursine Horror going to a utility category instead of an offensive category is huge. So now we're going to get more damage out of Pulverize, and with the base damage buffs to Pulverize is going to see a great Season 9. I definitely think Pulverize will be breaking Pit 100. How much higher than that? I have no idea. But it's kind of hard to quantify with the overpower nerfs, so it's going to be a little bit of back and forth. Hopefully it still does really well. Aspect of Metamorphic Stone was increased to 160% of normal damage. And you'll see later there's actually another Boulder buff to the Dolmen Stone, so Boulder is also going to be doing really well in Season 9. Now this is one I'm super excited about because I gave this feedback directly, and this is the most satisfying build I have played on Druid maybe ever. But Aspect of Seismic Shift is what allows your Earth Spike to attack in a line, and I asked them to give us 2 rows of spikes or more, and they ended up doing it. So we're getting the damage increase and we're getting a second row of spikes. This is literally doubling the damage, and on PTR, without perfectly optimizing this build, I was able to clear a Pit 80 or so. So we're doubling our damage from there. This is going to be in a pretty good spot. Another feedback I gave is that Overcharge aspect has basically never been used and it just needs a rework of some kind. Well, this is what they did. So instead of the thing that I had before, which wasn't really getting use, now it is a straight damage multiplier for storm skills. But we have to deal lightning damage to stack it up. I'll have to look at the wording on this one. It might be a similar situation to the Rampaging Werebeast, where it's getting multiple small multipliers and that ends up being more than 65%. But either way, it's another multiplier that can potentially go into builds where we might not have a good one to access. So I'm definitely all for it. One thing that comes to mind for this is Cataclysm, because Cataclysm typically doesn't have a lot of great multipliers for it because it's an ultimate, but this should work great for Cataclysm. For the unique items, they buffed the Rotting Lightbringer, so I will actually be using this in my Pulverize build. When I tested on the PTR, I decided I didn't like this as much as the normal Pulverize, but I think it's definitely worth using now. We got more willpower, more flat damage for poison, which is actually a huge amount different. And the main thing is that instead of it being on a 10-second cooldown, which was terrible, now if there's not a puddle around you, your Pulverize is going to put one down. And from what they showed in the dev stream, you can just spam these nearby, and I don't know if you can get overlap. Maybe if you have Pulverize size, you can get overlap. Maybe it doesn't work that way. I don't know. We'll have to test that. But if you can overlap these, that's actually insane. Regardless of whether you can overlap them, one of the interesting things is that the Shockwave aspect can now trigger the puddles, which is a 60% damage. So even if you can't overlap the puddles themselves, your shockwave should be able to trigger an entire line of puddles, and if you have enough size, that should cause them to hit more than one enemy per shockwave. So this could actually get kind of crazy if you stack it correctly. We'll see. They also buffed the damage from the Great Staff of the Crone for Storm Strike. So instead of 250%, it's 350. So that's just another increase to the Stormclaw build that's going to be great. And here's that buff for the Dolmen Stone. Instead of 40%, it's actually 50% per boulder now, which, if you haven't done the math, is 500% damage. Pretty crazy. They also gave us some new tempering options. We've got Pulverize Size, which I was talking about a second ago, Maul Size, which I don't think is very relevant, and they moved Petrified Duration out of the Nature Magic Innovation, which is actually good because now if you're trying to focus the Petrified Duration, that's going to be easier to hit. And if you're trying to focus the Hurricane Duration, which is normally what you go for in the Nature Magic Innovation, now it's going to be easier to hit that because they removed the Petrify. Now that's the gist of the main changes. There were the previous patch notes that had even more changes, but that's all I'm going to go over for now. Make sure you guys keep an eye out for all of my builds and videos that I'm going to be putting out for Season 9, because I'm going to cover everything on Druid. And when I say everything, I mean everything. These are just the ones that I currently have updated, and I'm going to update them even more now that we have the new notes. And I still have multiple builds that I need to go through in order to get them updated for Season 9. But I'll make sure to get a detailed video for each of those for you guys. And I'll drop them in my Discord at discord.gg/screamheart. And I'm also going to be live on Twitch when the season starts. So I'll see you guys there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Daddy Druid out.
Subscribe to Screamheart. He's more than an old fart. He makes lots of fun builds. I promise his streams chill. He should probably be faster. Come watch this disaster.